Do you need an agenda? Yeah.
Scott, how are you? Good.
I don't mind if you take notes on it. And I was like, oh my God, I'm not doing the dishes because we've been in Airbnbs for like, since the kids were little, really. Or something else. Still doing
Test.
Thank you so much.
Just share this one.
Because I looked at the sharing is caring prices and I was like, I'm gonna hand wash. I don't get to talk.
All right. Good evening, everyone. Thank you for joining us for this joint meeting of the Beverly City Council and the Beverly School Committee. Those who are here with us in the auditorium and those who are watching us on BevCam. So thank you to BevCam for being here. It's a pleasure to get to co-lead this meeting with School Committee President Rachel Abel and City Council President Julie Flowers. So we're going to go ahead and get started. BevCam is ready, and it's nice to be together here in this place. So I will call to order the Beverly City Council on this meeting on March 23rd at 7:30 p.m. The clerk isn't here, so Julie will call the roll. Councilor Bowen. Here. Councilor Crowley.
Here.
Councilor Feldman.
Here.
Councilor Houseman.
Here.
Councilor Rand.
Here.
Councilor Rotundo.
Here.
Councilor St. Hilaire.
Here.
Councilor Sweeney.
Here.
Councilor Flowers. I'm here. President Abel.
Sure, it's my pleasure to call to order the Committee of the Whole for the Beverly Public Schools School Committee. I will also call the roll this evening. Mayor Cahill.
Here.
Kimberly Coelho.
Here.
Karen Robinson.
Here.
Dr. Jeffrey Silva.
Here.
Ms. Lorinda Visnick.
Here.
I am Rachel Abel, and absent this evening is Dr. Kenan McKenzie.
Thank you very much. Councilor St. Hilaire, would you lead us in the Pledge of Allegiance, please?
I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all.
Thank you very much, Councilor St. Hilaire. So on our agenda this evening, we have two different presentations, as you can see. We have one from members of our school leadership who will be talking to us about coming out of the pandemic and supports for the school community. And then we do have a presentation from our budget leadership to talk about coming out of the pandemic and where we see the trajectory going for the city and the school budget. President Abel and I, in talking about this meeting, discussed that a format that we think would work best and allow for everyone's presentations and then questions to be heard is for us to hear the presentations, try to hold our questions till the end. So if you have a question as the presenters are talking, maybe make a note of it. They may cover your question as they keep going. And then once we get to questions and answers, we'll alternate. So I will take a question from a city councilor, and President Abel will then take a question from a member of the school committee, and we'll continue back and forth that way until people have had a chance to ask their questions. Did I forget anything?
Thank you. Thank you, President Flowers. That's exactly right. So we'll respectively call on our members. Thanks. Yeah. Sure. Well, really, Dr. Turachek and her leadership team have put together a presentation on post-pandemic supports and opportunities for our school community. So take it away.
Awesome. Thank you. And I think everyone can hear me with that? Okay, great. So thank you. We're actually really excited to be and to see everybody here on the stage. It's really nice to be together. I think back to just before the pandemic when I was had the opportunity to meet individually with a lot of city council members, and I haven't been able to do that as often as possible. Is that better? Okay. We came together and tried to figure out how best to present some information to all of you. We know that one thing that's always of interest to the council members is our budget, and typically we show up somewhere in the beginning of June and throw a lot of numbers on the screen and say, here's the budget and here's what we want. So we thought this would be a great opportunity from the school leadership team to hear, first of all, a quick preview of what we're thinking about as we enter into the budget season. I have prepared a small presentation that should hopefully explain a pretty complicated formula of Chapter 70 funding to help those of you understand, because there was a large incremental increase for the city of Beverly this year. So just a little background information for some of you to have as you're entering into the budget season also. And then I think Bryant is going to have an opportunity to talk a little bit about the city's finances, and then we're going to transition into what we are calling the opportunities and supports that we identified through the pandemic process. So what are we spending all that money on, and why, what are we trying to do in order of our school district, especially in light of the past 2 years that we've all been working through in the pandemic. So that's an overview of what we hope to present. Those of you who have heard me present before know that I always begin every presentation with a focus on our district goals. Budget is probably one of the most important areas where we need to make sure that we have specific goals that drive our decisions that we make around our budget. And so you'll see this from me a lot and throughout all my presentations, but always thinking about what are the goal areas that we have identified that we need to continue to work on in the Beverly Public Schools. So there's 4 large categories: engaged learning and inclusive practices, rigorous and consistent curriculum, instructional design thinking, and project-based learning, and operations and management practices. So I think as we specifically speak to the budget in FY23, the FY23 budget has several factors that impact the decisions that we make. Can you all see? Do you want me to twist that a little more?
I think it would be helpful for at least one of them.
Let me give that just a little more of a twist.
Oh, there's one over here.
Thinking, a little more. Yeah. There you go.
This is very Vanna White, Israel.
Is that right? Is that good now, everybody?
That's good.
And it's also over there at the same time. However, when Bryant presents, it's only going to be here. So, okay. So every year when we enter into budget season, we always have to figure out what are the factors that are going to impact our decision making around the FY23 budget. So those areas in particular are contractual obligations, enrollment and staffing, resourcing for accelerated learning. In this particular budget cycle, we know that we have a number of resources that are available to us that aren't always available. We look to what our department funding requests are, and this year we do have multiple sources of funding that are available, and making sure that we're identifying efficiencies and making sure that we're utilizing funding in the way that best meets the needs of our school district. We have a very specific budget process that we follow through, and we have actually completed all of these tasks to date. Within our budget process, the season actually starts somewhere in November when we begin identifying the priorities of the school committee and some of the stakeholder groups that we have across the city. We collaborate with the principals and central office to develop sort of a shared framework to guide those decisions. We assess the enrollments, and we look at the impact that will have on staffing. We identify administrative efficiencies and any restructuring opportunities that the additional funding might bring us. We look to review requests for funding from various departments. And we collaborate with the city to determine a proposed city contribution in relationship to the school budget. So once we've had a lot of these meetings, we sit down, the mayor and Bryant and Jean and I, and we talk a little bit about what our needs are and what we think we need for the services that we need to provide within the appropriated budget, and we come up with a proposal for that number that I then bring forward to school committee, and then school committee has the opportunity to hear and look through all of the suggestions that we're making. And then, so I review that draft proposal with school committee. So that's where we are in our stage right now. The school committee has seen an initial draft of the proposal. We have meetings planned from now until our public hearing, which is early May. We will continue to have discussions at all of our school committee meetings around that budget until we get to the point where we're ready to hold that budget hearing on what our final draft proposal will be. One of the things I mentioned earlier is that we really take the time to meet and identify what our priorities are moving forward. So this year I met individually with each school committee member. I met with the PTO president's group. I met with the union and some union leadership. I met with the leadership team and with individual building principals to say, what do you think our priorities need to be? How do we need to funnel? What are the areas that we need to focus on making sure that we're resourcing well for the FY23 school year? So very high on the list. No big surprise in light of the pandemic that we have all just been living through. Social, emotional, and mental health is a really big, important area. We want to make sure that when we make budget decisions, we're targeting and addressing any areas of trauma and stress that are happening for any of across our community, for our students, for our families, for our staffing, for our teachers, making sure we're providing those supports. In particular, thinking about after the bell activities, how can we make sure that we have the appropriate resourcing for that? Increasing counselors and looking to outside partnerships to make sure that we have, we're accessing all available options for our families. Looking for tools for teachers to support them and to support them as they support students in trauma-sensitive classrooms, and then any additional mental health services that we may need within the schools to address some of the greater needs that we're seeing. We are seeing an increased need in all of these areas, and so we're making a lot of shifts in some of the ways that we're looking at how we provide services to families and how we help families access services, even if they're not services that we ourselves are providing. Curriculum, teaching, and learning is a very, hopefully, a very most important part of everything that we do. We have some particular ideas that we want to make sure that we're looking at this year, and these were priorities that were raised by school committee members and other stakeholder groups. Top for us has been aligning equity. We want to make sure that that the experience that you have in the Beverly Public Schools is not reliant upon your race, your ethnicity, your economic status. We want to make sure that opportunity and access is there for everyone, in that there's equity in how we are able to provide that for people. Professional development continues to be a big area. Dr. Flaherty is going to speak a little bit later this evening about some of the work we're doing around high-quality curriculum and how we're supporting teachers in rolling out some of that, and how we're utilizing some of the funding sources that we have to improve our curriculum resourcing. And then substitutes, I think we continue to address the need to make sure that we had several in the roller coaster ride of the pandemic, waves when we really were struggling, making sure we had coverage in the classrooms, but also how are we making sure that we're bringing people into the district that we have available when we need to have them. Under operational, we have transportation is a priority, and largely because transportation costs have skyrocketed. So we know we need to make sure that we're resourcing for that as best we can. In addition, human resourcing, we have some goals specific to human resources. Are we attracting and retaining the strongest staff for the Beverly Public Schools? Is that staff representative of our communities, and are we attracting a diverse pool of candidates for our programs? And then finally, there were a lot of folks that wanted to focus our priorities on communication, making sure that there's more information available to families on after-school activities, that we leverage the digital resources that we identified through the pandemic that were effective to make sure that our family engagement access is still there. That was one of the, I think, surprise opportunities that arose from the pandemic for us. But all of a sudden, when we held a parent forum, there were 60 parents on the line, when if we had held an in-person forum, we were maybe lucky to get 20 families to be able to come. So we realized that this digital opportunity has really allowed families to access the resources and be part of the school communities in a way they weren't before. So making sure that we're looking at keeping that going instead of reverting back to old practices. And then, looking how do we effectively share out school committee communications, and likewise, how do we have a standard expectation for pushing out information at our school buildings, and parent-teacher communication, how are we making sure that we're where we need to be for parents, that they understand and that they can access and have communication with their teachers. So these are areas of priorities that the school committee and other stakeholder groups came up with, and these priorities really have also a huge factor in how we create our budget in our budget process.
So our budget proposal that we're coming forth with this year for FY23 does have contractual obligations. Our COLA is estimated at 2.25%, which is $1,006,251. Our steps for the all units in the school department is $648,221. Lanes, which would be educational crossing the lanes or columns they're referred to, is $265,530, and healthcare increase at 3% is $200,000 is what our obligations will be just moving forward into FY23. Just a reminder that our FY22 city contribution was $54,785,483, and Chapter 70 in FY22 came in at $10,590,914. So our final budget appropriation for FY22 was $65,376,407. The proposed proposal that we're bringing forth to school committee would be an additional $1,415,964 from the city. And the Chapter 70 at the governor's budget proposal is $13,158,441 for a proposed final budget of $69,359,898. Currently, the legislative process does show here shows you the calendar of it, where FY22 is that $10,590,000. The governor's budget at $13,158,000, and we're waiting patiently for the House Ways and Means budget to come through with theirs, which is estimated in April, followed by the Senate in May, and then the final in June.
So I'm going to do this one, and then we'll switch in a minute. I'll do this first. So I think one of the things that is a big question, and what we hoped to at least provide some background information for all of you before we started was, I think if you noticed, the increased Chapter 70 funding, right? So in FY22, the city received $10,599,14, and right now in the governor's budget, the proposed Chapter 70 funding is at $13,158,441. So for those of you who have been around for that, that's a pretty good incremental increase for Beverly. It's $2.5 million, or my superintendent way of saying it. Jean would have told you exactly how many dollars it was. But I thought it would be important for you to have some reference why. Like, why did Beverly get $2.5 million? And what is that targeted to do? And how are we supposed to think about that in terms of how we make decisions about our budget? So I have sort of a small primer on Chapter 70, and so I'll walk you through. First of all, I think the first thing that we do need to think about is that we really should celebrate that we have a finance system that in terms of Chapter 70 funding that is driven by student needs. So this formula is actually a formula that's created, that's driven by student needs, and then factors in a community's ability to pay. That's the attempt that's being made through Chapter 70 funding to provide resourcing to cities and towns in a more equitable way. The bottom, I think we say we have not reached all of our targets on that, but I think that the FY23 proposal brings us closer to that, and that's the attempt that's being made as this refunding has gone through the process. Specifically, what it does is it quantifies annual targets for the cost of educating students, and it does that by looking at the need of students within a district. So there's different formulas based upon the category of needs. So students that are categorized as low income or economically disadvantaged get a higher amount of money allotted to them per pupil than students that are not. And then finally, it does identify how costs should be divided between state and local taxpayers, and that's really where they take into ability that community's ability to pay. I wanted to not leave out the Student Opportunity Act, and I think we've all come to a better understanding of this whole process of the Student Opportunity Act. I think 2.5 years ago, we were thinking it was going to be a line item, that we were going to get a sum of money that was given to us that was the Student Opportunity Act funding. And in truth, the Student Opportunity Act is the legislation that shifts the formula for Chapter 70 funding. So it's not ever identified that Beverly got $140,000 for the Student Opportunity Act until you peel apart the formula and know where you are. So, but the Student Opportunity Act is really one of the major factors that's pushing up the foundation rates in Beverly, and Beverly's a really good example of how that works. Some of the elements that are taken into consideration within that Student Opportunity Act are how many students are low income, how many students are special education, how many students are English language learners, what are the benefits and fixed charges. They made some adjustments around that, around benefits and fixed charges and costs that are assumed, and they look also at guidance and psychological services. So these are some of the elements that are built into that legislation. If you take a look and read it through, there are certain formulas for all of those different things. How are the increases distributed? So there are really factors that impact the increase. The foundation budget, in particular enrollment, and in particular for Beverly, under enrollment was low income, and I'll address that in the next slide. Inflation was factored in, and there is a cap at what the inflation is factored in at, which is, I think, 4.5%. That's under some debate right now. People would like to see that go higher because the actual inflation rates have exceeded that. I don't know that when it was set at 4.5, people anticipated the rise that we've seen in the last year or two. And then it looks at wage adjustment factor, which really just means that in different sections of the Commonwealth, the wages are different, right? And so there are the salary rates and the salaries in different parts are different, and they do have an adjustment for that. They look at, for the local contribution, they factor in your property value, they factor in income, and they factor in the municipal revenue growth factor. But in general, the two largest factors that impact the increases that cities and towns are receiving, or lack of increases right now in cities and towns, are enrollment and inflation. And so based on these factors, there really was a wide range. Some folks saw minimum $30 per pupil, and other folks saw all the way up, like some of the gateway cities, Fall River received $1,920 per pupil. So that really is a wide disparity, and the factors really in those areas are the enrollment and the inflation. So in Beverly, our Chapter 70 funding for 23 is based on October 1 enrollments. That's always really important to understand that there has to be a date, and so they choose a date in the sand when they apply that. And while statewide enrollments have really dropped by almost 30,000 students across the state, in Beverly, we had really stable enrollments. So our numbers in FY23, we have a slight decrease of 18 students. And in Beverly, with 4,700 students, 18 could be on October 1, and on December 1, you might have had a different number. So we're relatively stable in our enrollments. And the biggest shift for us, however, while we didn't have a change in the number of students enrolled, the number of students identified in low income in Beverly had a significant shift. And I'll address that in the next slide. I actually jumped the gun and talked about inflation. Inflation is set at 4.5%. But however, in reality, the actual inflation rate for the first quarter was 5.9%, and in the fourth quarter was 7.3%. This is a target that's moving in the subject of a lot of debate right now, I think, as to how we could do it. Just if they had used the 5.9%, just sort of as a benchmark for you, it would have meant an increase of $155 million to the foundation budget and $98 million in aid. 4.5% versus 5.9%. So that's why inflation is a really important factor to keep in mind. So the real thing I wanted to share with you is, so why did Beverly receive an increase in FY23? The major factor for the increase in funding in Beverly was the number of low income, and these were students that were matched through the direct certification process. So the increase impacts the formula in 3 different ways. First of all, the Act reinstated the definition of low income used prior to 2017. So from 2017 to 2021, they were using 133% of the federal poverty level. It reinstated it back to the 185%, which was the number that they used prior to 2017. And also, the number of students identified as low income in Beverly rose by 250 students, from 1,422 to 1,672 on our October 1 reporting. And Beverly's percentage of low income rose from 30 to 36%, and that moved us to a different group, which increased the incremental base by $262 per student. So that's literally how they factored all that money in to get us. In FY21, Beverly received the minimum amount of $30 per pupil. In our incremental increase was $360,000, some of which was our After Dark program. In this year, we're receiving the $2.5 million. So I wanted to just categorize one thing. I think some people might be wondering how we went, if we didn't get an increase in enrollment, how we went from up 250 in low income. But the way that we are identified, students are identified as low income, there are really 3 ways. First of all, any families that are participating in state public assistance programs, whether it's supplemental nutrition assistance program, transitional aid for families with dependent children, mass health or foster care, those are direct certification. We get notification from the state that those are families that are eligible for low income. There's also an opportunity to be certified as low income through supplemental data collection. That's the sort of old-fashioned way of filling out a lunch form or doing some of those things. And then finally, anybody that's reported as homeless through McKinney-Vento is also considered eligible as a low-income family. So that, I think in some ways, the direct certification really identified more of our families than we had been identifying previously, or perhaps pre-pandemic, right? So the pandemic, again, we're looking at factors from the pandemic that have influenced. There are some other factors that contributed to it. Again, the Act, again, remember that Student Opportunity Act, which is driving some of this, it also assumes in-district special education enrollment for 5%. It changed the percentages, and it just offered us more money. There's lots of numbers and figures, but in essence, the assumed in-district costs, we received more money for. Students who attended the After Dark program, so I know that we've given a presentation to school committee. I think the City Council is aware of our After Dark program. It's a partnership with Essex Tech, and we have some students, about 40 students who attend in the mornings for Beverly High School as core Beverly High School students, and then they attend at the Essex Tech. There is an incremental increase of reimbursement that comes as part of the CTE, it being a CTE program. And so we get that reimbursement in the form of Chapter 70, but please know we also pay that bill to the Essex Tech. So that was factored in. And then again, the employee benefits inflation rate was applied, and so there was a 4.51% increase for that. So I'm going to stop, and then, I don't know, do you want, if anyone has questions on that before I turn it over to Brian, or if you want, but I thought that perhaps that would just at least give you some working background knowledge as you enter into the budget and start to think about that school budget. So.
Thank you, Dr. Trocheck. I think let's hear from Mr. Ailes, and then we'll circle back for questions.
Bethany, you don't have his, so I'm sorry, but his is only going to be up here, but I'll make sure that I turn it for you. It was a late ad.
Hot off the presses.
I love hot off the press. How do I do present?
Need to be at a microphone.
Click it one more time. When you click that down, there should be a little icon there.
Play from start.
Okay, perfect. Thank you. Good evening, everybody. So I'd like to, it's not showing on that one.
We don't have it on this side.
Oh, okay. Okay. So I wanted to touch on a couple different things this evening. I think in the main, in a similar theme to what Dr. Chirochik was talking about, we wanted to give you a sense of what the pandemic has done to the city in terms of its finances and kind of where we are now and where we're looking to go in the coming year. And there's some other pieces I've included as well. So just a quick recap in terms of the impact of the pandemic on the city's finances. The pandemic hit towards the end of FY20, as you all know. At that point in time, there was a lot of uncertainty, particularly with the economy and how it would react to the pandemic. We know that we have a certain number of potentially volatile and economically tied revenue streams in the city, and we were concerned about those because of the lack of certainty with where we were headed. So at that point in time, the city chose to implement a soft spending freeze on discretionary spending so that we could prepare ourselves to be able to weather a storm in the event that it was significant. And so we did that at the end of FY20. We also chose at that point, the mayor actually implemented the executive order to delay the collection dates of certain municipal revenues and provide relief to taxpayers. That affected our cash flows a little bit, but it was entirely manageable in conjunction with the spending freeze. So as we looked at that same point in time, closing out FY20, we were beginning to build FY21. There was still uncertainty in the realm of finances, but we were beginning to see some deterioration in revenue streams that were giving us some pause. And so when we built the initial FY21 budget, we still didn't know what the state aid figures were for FY21. So at that point, we kind of battened down the hatches and said, we are going to provide a level service budget. We are going to do it without laying off anybody. We're going to keep people on the payroll. And we're going to reduce our expected revenue streams, similar to what we've seen in past recessions. And we're going to draw on the stabilization reserve to backfill some of those lost revenues to get us through the potential downfall of the finances. Thankfully, when the state passed their budget, they restored state aid to a level that allowed us at that point to restore many of the spending decisions we had to make building the FY21 budget and remove the need to draw on the stabilization fund to balance the budget. So that was a very important step for us. Now, here we are in FY22, and we noticed that leading up to FY22, that some of the impacts to some revenue streams were not as significant as we had planned for and were prepared to deal with. And so we were able to build some of that revenue back into the FY22 budget, but cautiously, because we still weren't out of the woods yet when we built the FY22 budget. That was a year ago. And so we proceeded with caution, but now here we are looking at FY23, and we've seen that most, if not all, of the revenue streams that are economically tied have rebounded to a pre-pandemic level. So we're back, and I'm going to show you some slides here that illustrate that. So these are the economically tied revenue sources that we always pay attention to. So building permits. If people aren't making money, they're not remodeling their houses. They're not out, building new developments. So we pay particularly close attention to this. You can see that there was a dip during the pandemic in actual revenues, but you can see the last little bullet there to the right shows that the FY22 level, even though it's slightly depressed from a high in FY19, it's still fairly consistent. So we're comfortable kind of grabbing some additional revenues as we go into the FY23 budget in this area. To the right, that chart is motor vehicle excise tax. If people don't have money in their pockets, they're not out buying new cars. So we're cautious about this particular revenue source. And even though it's a little more volatile year over year, as you can see kind of the zigzag chart, we can say that in FY22, we're still at a comfortable level that is pre-pandemic. So we're basically able to capture some additional revenues there. Room excise, meals excise, this is nothing unusual that people wouldn't expect to see here. When the pandemic hit, restaurants were impacted hard, and people weren't out in hotels. And so you can see those large dips during the pandemic in these revenue sources. But I'm happy to report, as we sit here today, you can see that they're rebounding back to a reasonable level when compared to the pre-pandemic revenue levels that we were taking in. And then I threw these last two on here because these are also economically tied revenue sources that the city relies on every year: new growth and state aid. The state aid I'll address first because that originally we were expecting some volatility there, but pleased to say, you can see from this chart that it has been fairly steady and actually has increased through the pandemic, and that has provided a significant resource for the city to continue its services at the level and quality that it provides. The new growth, however, you can see that it from the peak in FY18 has kind of precipitated down a little bit. We think the last few years have been propped up by a lot more home projects. People are home. Interest rates are low, housing values are high, so people are accessing that equity and doing work at home, which is kind of propping up some of this new growth value. But you can see that the levels here are still north of $1 million. So when we look to FY23, we're fairly comfortable to be able to capture $1 million next year. Probably more we'll build into the budget and still be comfortable within a range of an acceptable actual. So here we are in FY23. So we talked about a lot of these, but here's where we're going to be able to capture some additional revenue. So for property taxes, I talked about new growth. We'll be able to capture at least $1 million in new growth in the FY23 budget. We also will be capturing roughly $2.2 million in new levy capacity, and that's a result of Proposition 2.5 and going up on the levy every year. And it's also net of an overlay reserve that we need to set aside. Motor vehicle excise tax, we'll be capturing an additional $400,000, which will bring it back up to pre-pandemic levels, as I said in the previous slide. Meals and room tax, those have, even though the room tax remains depressed, the meals tax has rebounded. And probably due to some takeout and people being more comfortable and kind of coming out now that the pandemic hopefully is behind us. So we'll capture an extra $200,000 from those sources. State aid, as Dr. Chirochik talked about, in total, the city will receive an additional $2.7 million in new state aid next year, according to the governor's proposal. Now, you saw the chart that Dr. Chirochik put up there. We're early in the process, and so we still need to see what happens through House Ways and Means, through Senate Ways and Means to know for sure whether or not this will materialize. But for now, we're planning on $2.7 million in new state aid. There is a loss of some state aid that's somewhat of a unique situation. When we built the Centerville and North Beverly schools decades ago, we had an agreement with the MSBA that they would reimburse us for a portion of the debt service. Well, we no longer have the debt service as of next year, so you see a decrease in the debt obligation on the expenditure side, but you see a decrease on the revenue side as well because the MSBA is no longer kicking in to pay for that debt service. Building permits, this is one that can be highly volatile. This, in the last recession, we saw a drop of about 56% year over year in this revenue stream. So we were very cautious over the last few years about relying too heavily on this revenue stream. However, as the chart shows, we didn't see the dip quite like we anticipated, and so we're fairly comfortable capturing some significant more revenue for the FY23 budget process. So that'll create an additional 400. And then we've got dozens and dozens of other much smaller revenue sources that combined will create an additional $250,000 to become available for the FY23 budget. So this is roughly a $6.2 to $6.3 million that can become available. We're still in the building process, so I caution you to kind of set these numbers in stone, but we're still working through and refining these projections. That can create an opportunity for a 4.4, 4.3% year-over-year budget growth going into FY23. The flip side to that equation is on the expenditure side and the obligations that we know we have coming into next year. So right out of the gate, we're a service-oriented organization. So much of our costs are tied up in payroll. because that's what we do, that's our business. So on the city side, to meet collective bargaining obligations, it's going to cost 1.2 in additional spending next year. Dr. Chirochik put up a slide that talked about the COLA increase, the steps and lanes for existing staff. That's about 1.9 million. So right out of the gate, we've got 3.1 million in new spending next year, and that's just for the existing staff. That's not addressing any staffing issues or new staff or shifting of staff or resources. That's if everyone stays the same. In addition to that, we contribute annually to the pension system, and that is scheduled, and I've got a slide in here that's going to get into that just a little bit more, but it's scheduled to go up $600,000 next year. Our health insurance, we are constantly reviewing this, and we're working with our consultant. This is the time we do this, but we're anticipating that going into next year, we're going to need to go up on premiums higher than 3%. Right now, we're holding a placeholder of $900,000. That represents roughly a 5% premium increase. I'm going to talk a little bit about that in a little bit. That healthcare premium contribution covers not only city employees, it also covers school employees, and it also covers all of the retirees, both city side and school side. Our sanitation costs, which is curbside collection, as well as recycling and incineration, is scheduled to go up $200,000 based on contractual obligations. And then Essex Tech Assessment. This is both a good and a bad story here. The bad is it's going to cost us $400,000 more next year, but the good news is we've got more kids going there. And so these assessments are based on the October 1 enrollment numbers, and we went from, I think it was 113 in the previous fiscal year's assessment to I think about 140 in this year's assessment. So you can see that we're taking greater advantage of the resources over at Essex Tech, which is a good thing. And then I talked about the debt service related to some of the school constructions from decades ago that will be falling off in terms of a gain, reducing our expenditures. So when you add all those up together, these are just kind of the big brush strokes that we know are happening for sure, that we absolutely have to deal with next year. That's 4.1 million. So when you look at 4.1 million in new expenditures and roughly 6.2, 6.3 in new revenue, that leaves about 2.1 million to do things with, to address everything Dr. Chirochik talked about or will be talking about as we go forward. And so that's the process we're in right now. The mayor's team is reviewing all of the needs on the city side. The schools are doing the same on the school side. And we're looking at where these resources are most efficiently, most effectively spent. But here's an example of things that we're looking to address. I mean, we know operational supplies and services are going up because costs of services are going up significantly due to inflation, due to supply chain issues. Those are real, and they're starting to hit our costs. Staffing adjustments, both on the school and city side. Paving, if we're able to put additional resources towards that. Additional school spending. IT investments. As we look to how best to deliver our services more efficiently, it's incumbent upon us to, at every chance we can, try to implement technological efficiencies so that we don't have to necessarily grow staffing, right? If we can do more with the same or less, that's a much more efficient way to operate a government. So it's sometimes important for us to make critical investments, and those aren't inexpensive. So that's kind of where we're at for the FY23 budget, but I did want to touch on just a couple other key pieces, because it's one thing to sit here and talk about the FY23 budget as the next 12 months operating, but I say this every time I get an opportunity to speak in front of you. We need to be mindful of other aspects of our financial situation. And another one that's really important to us is our long-term liabilities. These all go together. And so the two main long-term liabilities that the city has kind of hanging over its head, and you can see them on our balance sheet, the first is our pension obligation. The pension obligation is managed by the Beverly Retirement Board, and that is basically the pension system for all retirees. Retirees pay into it, and the city pays into it, and upon retirement, city employees are eligible for varying levels of pensions, depending upon how long they've worked and their age. This is, and I don't know if you're going to be able to see that because it is small numbers, but if you squint, maybe you can see it, but I'll highlight the key takeaway from this. This is a chart that shows the last 7 years, with the most recent being December 31st, 2020, of our net pension liability. So how much we owe, less the assets we have, gets us to our net pension liability. And so the good news is that when you compare our assets to the overall liability, our funding ratio, that's what we call that, is going up. So you can see we've been successful over the last 7 years of increasing our funding ratio to a point where in the last valuation, we were just shy of 70% funded. That's good news for the city. And in fact, over the last, I think it was 6 months, the retirement board came to the council looking for an adjustment to the COLA base for retirees because we're in a much healthier position than we were 5 or 6 years ago when we were funded at 56% of our overall liability. But to give you a sense of what the liability is, if you can't read it, it's $72.7 million in outstanding liability. But we've got a plan. So this is our plan to pay down that liability. Unfortunately, it increases at 4.5% annually, and it's significant dollar value. So when you look at our annual budget growth, 3 to 4% has been historically kind of where we land. 4.5% is a major expense, is going up 4.5% every year. It leaves a little bit less for other things. But the good news here is that we're on target to meet our fully funded obligation, and this chart shows us meeting it by 2033, which is quickly coming upon us. The other major liability that you need to be aware of is our OPEB, other post-employment benefits. It's real, and it's the costs of delivering health care to our retirees and our current employees in the future. Hold on to your seat because this one's a little bit bigger. This one, we have an actuarial team that comes in and values this liability every year. And this is a year-over-year comparison of our liabilities, and you can see that at the close of FY20, June 30th, 2020, we had an outstanding liability of $397 million. At the close of FY21, we had an outstanding liability of $420 million. So it's going up, and that's two reasons. One is simply the discount rate that's being used that the actuarials are using to calculate the long-term liability, and that discount rate is tied directly to the municipal bond rate. So because it went down, so too did the discount rate, so too does then the liability actually goes up. As the municipal bond rates increase, and if inflation hits and market rates dictate that municipal bond rates go up, the discount rate will also go up and will drive down slightly this number. So this number ebbs and flows. But a more important aspect as to why this number is going up is look at the total plan members. These are the plan members that we're covering. So last year, at the end of FY20, we had 1,731 plan members. At the end of 21, we had 1,772 plan members. So that's additional staff we brought on that we're now obligated to cover their health care for. And it's also things like someone retires. Well, they're still a plan member if they retire, but yet we're looking to backfill their last position. So now you have 2 plan members, whereas before you had 1. So it's a combination of both, but it's still, nonetheless, it's something we all need to be mindful of. And then the last piece I wanted to touch on is reserves. And I wanted to just touch on a couple things because recently at the City Council, we had a request to transfer some free cash into reserve, which is a policy that we've set as a city. This chart, many of you have seen, the orange bars represent the stabilization reserve levels. Okay, and you can see in 2022 that the top of that orange bar is a little bit below the middle of the green swath that grows across your screen. The green swath represents the target range for our reserve balance. And that's not arbitrary. That's based on, remember back at the beginning of the presentation I was talking about economically tied revenue sources. So as a city, we're vulnerable to those economically tied revenue sources fluctuating. So when you look back in time and see that at the last recession, state aid was cut by 20%. The recession before that, it was cut by 24%. you need to be prepared to be able to backfill those lost revenue sources in the event of a recession. And so we've calculated what an acceptable range is for these reserves to be able to help us. It's not the silver bullet that's going to get us through unscathed, but it will help us through the next recession. The policy that we have currently is that every year when free cash is certified, we transfer 10% over. And here's why. You can see that the green swath actually climbs every year. That's because every year we expect the budget to grow every year. And when it does, the amount or the percentage of the, let me say this right, the percentage of the stabilization fund balance to the budget declines unless you keep pace with the amount the budget is growing. So I modeled what it will look like, oops, wrong way, for the next 8 years or so. If we continue to do a 10% transfer every year as our policy dictates, this is what it'll look like. And you can see that we stay steadily within the range of where we ultimately want to maintain this balance. And that assumes a free cash certification annually of $8 to $9 million. So 10% of that $8 to $9 million being deposited into this every year keeps us right within that sweet spot. And then I just want to end on a few, you may all remember I like to kind of leave some takeaways at the end of a presentation for things for us to digest. These are the things we need to keep our eye on, and not just through FY23, but over the next couple of years. First two up here are things we as a community can't really control. Okay, we've got regional and the national economy. There are some components that will affect the city. Mainly inflation, supply chain issues. We're already seeing the impact of that. What was a $180,000 dump truck is now a $280,000 dump truck, and it takes more than a year to get here. So we're seeing real issues. We need to plan farther in advance now than we used to, and we need to be mindful of the increasing costs. The other piece that we can't control is investment market volatility. I talked about those long-term obligations that we have for the city. Those assets are held with a wealth management company on the retirement board's behalf called the Pension Reserve Investment Trust. It's invested in stocks and bonds. So as the market fluctuates, our asset values will fluctuate. And if the market goes down, our asset values go down. And if our asset values go down, our funding ratio goes down. And if our funding ratio goes down, our contribution into that plan needs to increase beyond the 4.5% that we've got scheduled if we want to maintain the same schedule of funding. So it's a direct impact to things that we've just talked about. Healthcare cost trends, I talked about 5%. We're seeing over the last 10 months an increase in healthcare costs that we're going to need to adjust our premiums going into that plan going forward. What we don't know at this point is whether that increase is a result of a backlog of healthcare needs, day surgeries, treatments, things that people may have put off during the pandemic and are now kind of catching up on, or if the actual cost of delivering services is increasing. And my gut's telling me it's a combination of both, so we would expect some of these costs to kind of wean themselves off over the next year or so. But it's still, nonetheless, something we need to continue to monitor. Payroll and staffing, we talked about a lot of things already, but every time we bring on a staff member, if that staff member makes 80 grand, well, it's the 80 grand, it's 20 grand for a family health care plan and premiums, and it's that OPEB, right? So for every staff member, it's probably that OPEB goes up by $200,000, right? So it's something to keep in mind. And then lastly, which is very important, and I always stress this, our bond rating. Having a good bond rating allows us to purchase more with the dollars we have because the money isn't being spent on interest. So we need to continue to understand how our decisions affect our bond rating because it's the taxpayers' buying power that is at stake here. And so I'll stop there, and I'll happy to answer any questions, or we can turn it back over to Dr. Chirocek, if you'd like.
Thank you very much, Mr. Ailes, and thank you also, Dr. Chirocek and Ms. Sherburne, for those two presentations sort of in tandem. I think this would be a good time for us to pause and take questions on these presentations. And so we'll do City Council, then School Committee. Councilor Rotundo, I see you are ready to roll.
Thank you, Madam President. It's actually not even a question. It's a comment and ask. The presentations you gave us tonight, would you forward that to the council and the school committee for us to have? Because it is very helpful, a lot of information for us to digest. I know a lot of people are taking notes, but I think it would be easy, too, for us as the process goes forward. So I don't have questions right now. I'll hold those as we go further into the budget process, but at least with the presentations, it will help us going forward. Thank you.
Thank you, Councilor Rotundo.
Yes, thank you, Counselor. Are there any committee members that wish to ask a question? Dr. Silva.
You mentioned about how technology is used, or ideally could be used to trim costs or save on some of the expenses. Can you give examples where that is happening within the city?
Sure. I can think of one that we implemented last year on the city side called Central Square, which is an online permitting consolidated database, which allows all of the activity that goes on department by department to be centralized, to be shared seamlessly, creating less time for, the running of interoffice mail, the coordinating of different databases to try to kind of cross-reference data, more easily accessible. So that's an example there, and that was a significant investment. It was hundreds of thousands of dollars, but it has brought our capability to a level where we don't need to spend as much time with kind of more remedial reconciling database tasks. One we're doing currently, and I'm going to look down the table here because we've talked about it a little bit, is as we're upgrading our new accounting software, we're looking to do some streamlined online services for employees, as well as some different types of components to that system that will make Jean here to my left and Aaron make their life a little bit easier, I think. So hopefully that, over the next few months, we'll start to see that roll out as well.
Do you see that when you implement those types of solutions, that affecting future hires in terms of tempering the need for additional hires for certain positions?
So I'd like to say yes, but the reality is that the demand on our staff is growing. We're being asked to do more. There's more volume. There's more intricacies. There's a higher level of tasks that need to get done. So what it's really allowing us to do is continue to tread water.
Okay.
I can't speak for the school side, but I'm sure they're in a similarly efficient way.
Thank you.
Thank you. I saw Councilor Houseman. And yes. Other councilors who are raising your hands, I'm making a list in my head, don't worry.
Thank you, Councilor. Thank you, President Flowers. Yeah, I think this is probably a question for Dr. Trocheck, having to do with the Student Opportunity Act. One of the things I keep track of with Mr. Ailes on the city side and that have learned has to do with continuing revenue streams versus one-time revenue streams, matching one-time expenses and continuing expenses. So I noticed in the Student Opportunity Act, you talked about this being, the slide was quite a while ago, so I may have this somewhat off, but basically a 6-year-long program, if I got that right.
So the Student Opportunity Act is legislation, and it's a 6-year implementation, and we're in year 2 of the implementation.
And is that a 6-year-long funding stream?
It just means that the way that funding comes, sometimes, and we had a conversation earlier this evening about whether something's fully funded or partially funded, and so they identify what the funding levels would be if they were fully funded and it's been rolled out in a percentage. So I'll give a concrete example that might be helpful. So the special education transportation, which is the reimbursement of that through the circuit breaker, comes in, and they decided that in 1 year they decided that we're going to now reimburse districts at whatever level they're eligible for special education transportation. But they're rolling it out over a 4-year period. So in year 1, you're getting 25% of the cost of that special education transportation. In year 2, you're getting 50%. In year 3, you're getting 75%. And then it will be at 100% of what's eligible for funding. So we're in year 2 of a 6-year rollout of all of the different portions of how they've identified, whether it's the in-district special education costs, whether it's the incremental increases based upon low-income students. So it's moving. We hope that it means that we'll continue to get incremental increases to address the increasing needs in our district, and as long as it remains on track to stay funded. But I want to be clear, the Special Opportunity Act is not a funding, it's a legislation. The money comes through Chapter 70, so you see the funds, they come into the district under Chapter 70 funding.
Yeah, thanks for the clarification. So to maybe reframe my question to make sure I understand it correctly, this will not create a funding source that all of a sudden stops at a certain period of time to
Great
which
question.
we've committed an ongoing set of programs or expenses.
That's a great question, and I believe that it is not a funding that should stop. It is now built in, and at the level that we're at now, whether it continues to increase is going to really be, I think, a part of how we continue to fund the legislation, whether we fund it fully or are at a lower level. And I think one of the things our hope is that we'll see these incremental increases probably up until about FY25. I think that's when we'll see those incremental increases have caught up, and there'll be less each year. I think we got a big jump this year because it was the year 2, but I do think we'll continue to see some increases in Chapter 70 funding based upon the impact of the factors that are identified in the Student Opportunity Act. I do think that there'll be a point at which that stops happening and we'll have hit our target, and that target would then remain more steady over the next few years.
And to your last point, at that point it would seem that the projection would be that the Chapter 70 would be built at that level and not all of a sudden drop off. Because
one would hope. I mean,
okay.
we've seen
No
changes in
that,
state funding over the years, but one would hope that, yes.
Okay, thank you very much. That's my question.
Okay, I saw Ms. Lauren Visnick first.
Mr. Ailes, I wonder, for those of us who are not municipal finance experts, if you could speak to how on God's green earth do we get so far behind in the 2 major liabilities that you mentioned, the pension liability and the OPEB? Is it that past administrations simply did not fund those as they should have? Or is it a universal truth? How can it be that we're so incredibly far behind in our obligations in those 2 areas?
Yeah, that's a great question. I mean, a lot of it has to do with when the pension systems were first developed, the legislation that developed them didn't really make them a solvent formula, right? They didn't make the contributions going in equal the contributions going out, kind of like Social Security to some extent. And so this ongoing liability just grew over time. And it wasn't till legislation, I don't know when it was passed, but it was probably decades ago, where they said, okay, enough's enough. Municipalities, you need to start contributing. So by law, we need to contribute to fully fund the pension system by 2040. That's the cutoff date. We're on a more aggressive schedule than that, which is a good thing, because once the pension gets fully funded, or gets close enough that we're comfortable kind of rolling forward, we can then look to shift those resources, those budget resources annually over to the OPEB and begin paying that down. There is not yet a similar legal obligation to pay down the OPEB trust, and we are not alone. All municipalities are facing this, but it is real. So we do need to, I do talk about it regularly when we talk with Standard & Poor's about the city's bond rating and how the city is financially, because they want to make sure that we're taking it seriously and that we've got a plan to eventually address it, because they know it to be real.
Fantastic.
Is that helpful?
Thank you, and I realized I've been remiss in not noting that the City Council's budget analyst, Mr. Jerry Perry, is here with us, so Counselors, if you do have a question that you'd like to have Mr. Perry weigh in on, he can certainly do that, and we can bring him up to the stage. I guess it'll be like Price is Right or something. We'll have him come on down and jump in front of a microphone. So thank you for being here, Mr. Perry. I saw Counselor Bowen next.
Great, thank you, and really appreciate the presentations. And my question may start to get us towards the second presentation as well, but I'm just curious how the annual budget process is going to look different this year given the additional needs, but also the additional funding that we have outside of recurring revenue streams to address current specific, hopefully temporary needs. So, you know, I know on both the school side and the city side, there is this infusion of funding from the federal level to support those needs. How and where do those numbers show up, and how and where do those needs get met?
So let me just give kind of a macro answer, and maybe you could get into kind of some of the initiatives. But you're absolutely right, and I'm actually looking back on my presentation, probably should have included some information about that, because the city has received various sources of revenue over the last couple of years related to the pandemic. Specifically, we've received some CARES funding, we've received some ARPA funding, and the schools have received some ESSER funding as well in a couple different tranches. And so I'll let Dr. Chirocek speak to that. But in terms of how that plays into our budget process, it's really a separate kind of bucket that sits out there because it's a grant and will be accessed as needed throughout the pandemic, and we have a few years to actually spend that money. It's a little more integral when you get to the schools because they've relied on that for some recurring type costs that we're beginning to try to pull over to the annual operating budget that you'll see this year. So.
Yeah, and thank you. And I think that's a great question. I think it aligns too with the idea when I was talking to Councilor Hausman that, you know, we have the incremental increase of Student Opportunity Acts is going to run through FY25. The ESSER funding that we have in the schools is going to be available until FY25. I have a keen sense of responsibility to make sure that as we do this, we don't create a budget that falls off a cliff in FY25, because if we do rely on the supplemental resources to do too many things, and then we hit FY25 and we either have to eliminate everything we've been doing. So within the schools and with the school committee, when I have been presenting our conversations as we build the budget, I've been identifying what expenses that we have that I'm applying to the appropriated budget, what expenses that we have that I'm applying to the ESSER funding, which is what the funding that the schools have. And we've been very careful so there's also a factor that there's only certain allowable expenses. So some expenses are only allowable in certain places. So it's been almost like a big jigsaw puzzle for us, trying to make sure that we're effectively utilizing resources the best way we can. We do have at this point in time some staffing positions on our ESSER funding, but we've been very clear to identify these as either one-year positions or two-year positions to specifically address learning loss or social emotional needs that we hope will be, addressed more and we'll have less of in the, future budgets. We keep a matrix, so to speak, of here's the expenses that are going in appropriated, here's what we're putting in ESSER 2. ESSER 1 is done, we've finished with that one. We also accessed some of the CARES money. The city, when the CARES money was here and in the throes of the pandemic, we utilized a lot of funding through them for our, to set up some of the remote learning that we did. The city paid for a lot of those expenses, a lot of our sanitation and cleaning and any physical adaptations that we made to buildings to accommodate. So we utilized that pool as well. But now we're really tracking what do we have, and what in FY23 are we using ESSER for? What do we plan to use ESSER for in FY24? And will we carry any of those over into FY25 because the funding actually ends on September 30th of 2024. So we're really watching and managing, really looking to put, and you're going to hear Dr. I keep talking about you, Doc. You might get a chance to speak one of these times. Dr. Flaherty's going to talk a lot about high quality curriculum. So that's one of the areas that's an allowable expense, and that's actually going to be a really big opportunity for us to do a refresh on a lot of our curriculum that we have, and we're utilizing that funding in that way. So we're tracking and identifying But as Brian alluded to too, sometimes we put something on ESSER and we say, no, this is something that we need for the long term outcomes to remain, and we've been shifting. So if we used ESSER in 22, I might have said to the school committee earlier, we're going to move these positions in because we think they're crucial and we need to keep them.
Councilor Bowen? Yeah, just I think that's really helpful to be able to see all the pieces of the jigsaw puzzle at once so that we see how it all fits together. And I think it's really smart to use some of the funding to get things going, even if we know it means needing to find other revenues for them later. So would love to see how that's reflected in other departments too.
I saw Ms. Robinson had her hand.
Thank you. So you mentioned that healthcare costs would be increasing, so I was just wondering if we were looking into providing our employees with different or additional options for healthcare.
So every year we do a review. We have a consulting team that comes in and helps us understand what's going on within our healthcare system. For those that may not know, we're a self-insured municipality, so we actually pay the healthcare costs of our insured. And we manage that in a way that provides, and I could say currently provides, a better plan with better benefits at a lower deductible, at a lower premium portion for our employees than many, if not all, of the state plans. And part of that has to do with the way we manage the plans and some of the health benefits that we try to implement and offer to our employees, pre-diabetic screening, opportunities to minimize ectoskeleton issues. Those are two of the major costs to any healthcare system. And so we're really aggressive in trying to roll out preventative programming. But we also kind of try to keep our eyes and ears on what the rest of the industry is doing. So we are constantly looking at the GIC programs, for example, to know where we stack up against those. And we're always looking at, are there adjustments we can make to the plan to not only make it a financially better plan for the city, but without impacting necessarily the employees and their spouses and the retirees.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Councillor St. Hilaire.
Thank you, Madam President. I have a comment and a question, if that's okay.
That is
comment from Mr. Ailes. So in your presentation, you're projecting revenue to increase by about $6 million, spending to increase about $4 million, and I think you characterized it as, an extra $2.1 million. And I saw a slide that had a slew of options for spending that $2.1 million. And I didn't see taxpayers listed on there. And, I think, just a reminder that, raising to the maximum 2.5% is a decision and a choice. And I would like to see taxpayers at least added to the conversation for discussion. And of the options that you did list, I would strongly say paving of roads and sidewalks is something that should be a priority. It's something I'm hearing a lot about in Ward 6, and would love to see more money spent on that. So that was just my comment for you, Mr. Ailes, and I appreciate the presentation. Dr. Trochak, I did have a question on the school side. So again, it looks like a projection of $69 million versus $65 million last year, is that right? That's about a $4 million difference, which I think is about a 6% increase. And I did see your slide where you talked about, I think it was about $2 million of obligated expenses that are going up, which again leaves about another $2 million extra. What are some of the areas that you're looking at for that $2 million?
So that some of it is going to be addressed in our future slides. So one of the things that we are going to talk about is the kinds of supports and opportunities that we have that we are going to be utilizing it on. If I were going to categorize it, I think we have a good chunk targeted to address the social emotional needs of students. We're looking.
Is that result in staffing? Is that staffing?
That one would be staffing. Yep. So in particular, we're looking at really firming up a multi-tiered system of support for our students, looking at overall wellness. We have I think that the majority of them are, some are enrollment driven, so we have, I think, 3 or 4 positions at the high school that are we just have more students in the high school than we have in the past, and so we need some staffing to address some of that, and we have some staffing at the elementary level and middle, just some small staffing issues that would probably be the other majority of that. But some of those things are enrollment, I mean, we have enrollment, we have to address enrollment as it comes along, so.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you, Counselor.
Were there any other school committee questions? Doesn't seem to. President Flowers?
Thank you. Any other questions from city councilors on this portion of the evening? Councilor Sweeney.
Thank you. Just building off of the question and points made by Councilor Bowen, Dr. Trochek, when you talk about using the ESSER funding in tandem with some of the more traditional funding streams for the growing needs of the school budget, is that, with the $69.4 million estimate, is that encompassing the universe of potential expenses, and then the ESSER funding would potentially supplement some of those costs?
Correct. So the 69 million, it would be the appropriated budget, the money that we would be utilizing, and then the ESSER funding, there's additional resources available in ESSER funding.
That makes sense, and I would just request, whenever you guys do have more of a solidified plan for how that funding will be used alongside the regular appropriated funding for the schools, I would certainly be interested.
Yes, yeah, we present those on a regular basis, so,
Come on over to F&F.
we do present that information regularly, so that's
good.
available and if anybody ever has questions, feel free to reach out to me, so that's
Okay,
always.
thank you.
Yeah.
Okay. I keep hearing these promises of additional presentations, and I'm very much looking forward to Dr. Flaherty and some of the other members of our school leadership. So we'll transition over to that, and after we'll have an opportunity for more questions.
So again, next slide, Bethany.
Yours is not up.
Huh?
You're not up.
Oh, what happened? PowerPoint does that too. I'm glad that was an easy recovery on technology, because it isn't always. So again, one of the things we wanted to do was talk a little bit about the, we all have just sort of spent 2 years kind of going through this pandemic, and we know that it has created a number of challenges for us, but we really wanted to come forward tonight and talk a little bit about what we have identified over the past couple of years that we need to provide our students as supports, and also what we hope is sort of a refreshing look at it and identifying some opportunities for us as we move forward as a school community. Again, I'll go back to our goals and our goal areas, but this time, instead of just the broad range of goal areas, I really wanted to at least share with all of you what our specific focus areas are, because that's our large goal areas, but under each one we have a specific action plan. And so this year, as we ended last year and built our budget, we really were looking very closely at some very specific areas. So one of them was culturally responsive teaching and social emotional learning, and hoping to support our educators to embed culturally responsive teaching and social emotional strategies in every classroom as we work with our students. A curriculum review and selection, that's one of the areas that we identified last year as really important, taking a look at to make sure that our curriculum resources were culturally relevant, that they were integrated, that they were aligned pre-K to 12 in the curriculum, and that the work was engaging and responsive to all student learning needs. In particular, and I know that some of you saw our report about our equity audit. In our equity audit, we really identified that one of the areas that we could take a very close look at is advanced coursework and ensuring that the percentage of racial subgroups and low-income students who accessed advanced coursework there was equal access and equal opportunity for all of our students in that area. We are addressing hiring practices to take a look at developing and implementing conventions that attract a diverse workforce, not only but reduces bias overall in the hiring process, and then recruiting and succession and developing and implementing some conventions that attract a diverse workforce to Beverly, but also, again, reducing the bias. So I have here our members of cabinet are all here. There are 6 of us. That is who make up our cabinet. We spend a lot of time trying to talk about what do we think that would be important for us to share as a school community to all of you and to the group together. So I know that we spend a lot of time in our school committee meetings talking about all of these things, but I think it's really nice to see an overview and a picture of what are those ideas and areas that we will be utilizing. We just spent a lot of time talking about numbers and budgets and formulas and legislation, but in practice, what does that look like in Beverly, and how are we using this money, and what are we doing for our students? So I'm going to turn it over to Dr. Flaherty. She's going to start us off taking a look and framing it for us. So.
Thank you and good evening. I would just like to start by saying, as you look at our focus areas that we worked on for this past year, I'm so proud to be part of a team, including our leadership team here, our building leadership, teachers, and our building staff, that we could have let COVID become all-consuming because it was a full-time job for the last 2 years, but it was not. We made sure that we wanted to keep our eye on what the most important part was, which is teaching and learning and the academic support and social-emotional support of our students. And you'll see that I got 4 slides. Those that know me know that I could talk about teaching and learning all night. So I had to try to boil it down to just some of the, give you a good overview of what we have been focusing on and accomplishing over the past year. And what we did was when we looked at those goals that Dr. Troche just reviewed with you, it really bottled all the way down to if we want to truly talk about equity, it came down to one phrase that was foundational for all of us, and that is, does all really mean all? Because until we can say that, then we won't be able to achieve the equity for all of our students that we're looking for. And so we decided that we needed to use that to frame the work that we were going to be doing. And so we started last October by doing a leadership retreat with all of our instructional leaders within the district. And we were at Endicott. And that's where we really started. We had some very frank discussions and reflections, and we really said, if we want to send the message to our schools, to our staff, to our community, that all does mean all, that these are some of the key practices that we need to see be reflected throughout all of our schools. And the first being, there was 6. We came up with 6 of our top practices that we wanted to make sure were the target in everything that we accomplished. The first is that universal design for learning is the norm in every classroom. And when we talk about universal design for learning, what that really means is that when I'm a teacher and I'm planning a lesson or a project for my class, I'm not making a one-size-fits-all product. We are looking at the students in each individual room, and we are thinking about what they need in order to access and to be successful in the outcomes and the learning objectives that we have. The second is that we hold high expectations for all through rigorous grade level curriculum and instruction. And you'll see in a moment that one of the ways that we do this is that we are looking and we have a review cycle for all of our major subjects and over a 5-year period. And as we're doing that this year, we are focusing on English language arts. But we are looking at the relevancy of the curriculum that we're using. We are looking for equity, we're looking for cultural proficiency, and we're looking for rigor. And those teams that are looking at that are made up of leaders and teachers throughout the district. We also want to look at the implementation of well-planned, data-driven. We've seen data driving a lot of our work at the elementary level for the last 7 to 8 years, and we now are moving that along because our students are going through the system, and we know that it makes a difference, that in order to do that universal design for learning and to meet the individual needs of our students, you need to use data because you need to know where they are, what they already know, where their learning gaps may be, and this became incredibly important as we looked at recovery from the post-pandemic. We also wanted to make sure that our learning is relevant. We want it connected to real world. And you've heard, because I know that it's a passion of Dr. Trochik, as it is for all of our leadership team, to focus on project-based learning. We want it to have relevance and to have it be connections to authentic learning for our students. We wanted to make sure that we were able to increase opportunities for all students to be able to access advanced coursework. And when you think about that, a lot of times people only think about advanced coursework being advanced placement classes once a student reaches the high school. But in reality, advanced coursework starts all the way back down in elementary level. So you want to make sure that you're doing some heterogeneous grouping. You're looking at students that get to access your rigorous curriculum, that you are not always putting, I always say, by the time a student's in second grade, they know who the sunflowers are and who the weeds are. And so they know and they feed on that. And we don't want to make sure that students aren't being made available to participate in rigorous advanced coursework all the way down into our youngest grades. We also put a commitment into using learning walks this year, and what that is that we put teams together, and the teams were comprised of district level administrators, building level administrators, one from the high school, one from the middle school, and one from the elementary. And we have gone to buildings at each of those levels with a focus. So one of our last learning walks, we were focusing on student discourse, and that's looking at the amount of time that students are doing the talking, using critical thinking skills, driving the learning, and not just being the receivers of knowledge. And so we were looking at that. Right now, we are in the process of doing our third round, which we'll debrief on Monday. And we each had to shadow 3 students, one that would be considered a high flyer or advanced student, one that was your solid average student in a classroom, and one that would be a struggling student within the classroom. And we followed them for a period of time so that we could look at the experience that each of those students had, make comparisons, and look at where there may be gaps in what students are experiencing depending on where they were or what classroom they were in. So we're looking forward to being able to debrief that next week. Right here is the schedule that I was showing you, the cycle of when we will be reviewing curriculum over the 5-year period. We started pre-pandemic with social studies, and that was in selected grades. That was the first year that I came here, and that was based on some resources that were timing out. And so that's why those were the ones that were done first. We approved some new curriculum at that point for the high school and for grades 8 because there was a change in the standards, as well as for social studies in grades 3 and 4 that also had a change in their standards. Last year, we looked at math, and as our school committee members know, you graciously supported a brand new math series. Our elementary students, we used the year before, we implemented a series called Zern because as we went remote, we needed a program that would work digitally as well as, the standard textbook. We needed something that was more available online. And you also adopted a new program, grades 6 through 12, called Reveal. So we updated our math curriculum last year. And as I had mentioned previously, we are looking at ELA. We have narrowed our selections at the elementary level down to 2 prospects. And we had teachers pilot each of those at the grade levels throughout the schools. They have finished one pilot. They're in the second pilot right now. We'll finish before April vacation. And we'll make recommendations back to central office and principals at the end of April to bring forward to CISL with a recommendation for a new elementary program in May. And the middle school and high schools have put together their committees. They are starting their work, and it will continue through the summer. And they will be ready to pilot some new texts, novels, and hopefully a standardized writing approach come next September. The focus for next year will be science and STEAM, as well as foreign language. They were originally on this year's review cycle, but there was changes to the standards that weren't ready in September, and so they got moved up until next year because those standards have been now adopted. Here are some overviews of some important pieces that we put together to help support our post-pandemic growth at the high school and at our K-8 schools. The first and biggest impact for that was that we hired 2 directors of innovative practices for the high school. There was one for humanities that covers English and social studies, and one for STEM that looks at our science and math classes. The key areas that these 2 women have focused on include working to build a consistent and standardized written curriculum in all of our 4 core subjects starting, and it will eventually be all of them. As you know, that was a recommendation in our recent NEASC findings. They are working on creation across the board of common assessments and common midterms and finals so that we can have the data in comparison to look at all students and making sure that they're having an equitable experience. That they have provided professional development in the areas of rigor and using data to make decisions in your instruction. They have implemented professional development with our new math series and making sure that that teachers have the support that they need to implement the new curriculum. And our humanities person will be leading the review for English language arts in grades 9 through 12. As I had mentioned, we do have the resource and the adoption committee that looked at the new reading series K through 4, and there is a committee that has been formed for middle school to look at whether they will continue a formalized program that the elementary adopts, if they'll do a hybrid, maybe 5-6, continuing with the formalized reading program elementary uses, and 7-8 following more in alignment with the high school and more project-based learning and novel studies rather than a anthology or just a program to use. We have increased coaching and interventionist support across the board, and that's to help students that did have some learning gaps or are struggling with post-pandemic work, but also allows us to do what we call acceleration, which means that we are not going back and reteaching everything that should have happened the year before. We're using the data to look at what students know and are able to do now, where some skills may be lacking, and we're targeting those skills in order to keep them on grade level learning, because if we don't, then they will just continue to fall further behind as each year rolls forward. We also have implemented curriculum roadmaps, and they're most flushed out at the elementary school, and they're very consistent, which allows to make sure that our skills and standards that are being taught are consistent across our 5 elementary schools so that we don't have different experiences depending on the school that you go to, but also allows for the implementation of some individualism around project-based learning. So it's a good balance between the 2. And for professional development, on our professional development all district days, as well as our building early release days, the professional development has been in one of 4 areas: cultural proficiency, rigor, social emotional learning, or the use of data. And then we wanted to make sure, and you'll hear us talk about multi-tiered system of support. It's a lot of jargon and words to just basically mean that students get what they need in order to be successful. And it looks at not just academics, but making sure that we're looking at academic needs, behavioral needs, and social emotional needs, because they're all interconnected, and you can't be successful in one without having the support in all 3 of those and making sure that your needs are met. So we do have at each of our schools a student support team that meets on a regular basis where they will talk about individual students and come up with plans or suggestions or recommendations on how to best meet those needs, and then they'll do what we call progress monitor, which means that they may try something for 6 to 8 weeks, and then they come back and they say, is it working? Great, they're on target, everything's going well. No, it's not working. Okay, what else can we try in order to make sure that we're meeting that student's needs? And then we also have, many of you have probably heard about individual education plans, which is what our special education students are on, but we also have what is called a district curriculum accommodation plan. And that is a plan that allows for accommodations for any student. It does not have to be a student that is on an IEP. And these go directly to helping a student to be able to be successful. So for an example, because there's pages of that go with the plan, if you're a student that needs a set of notes because you can't make the visual and the handwritten part, one of the things could be that you're provided a written set of class notes in order to be able to meet and access the curriculum. We have math literacy coaches at all of our elementary schools, as well as reading coaches in the middle school and high school. We purchased Alex, which came with the math resource, our new math resources in grades 6 through 12. And we ended up buying a license for all students in grades 6 through 12 because it is a program that allows individualized learning for students. It's intuitive, so it's skill-based, and this will meet a student where they're at and give them more practice in the area that they need in order to be successful, and it adapts. It either makes the work less challenging or more challenging depending on how they answer a problem, and it will change to do that. We thought this was important, especially one, with a new math series, and two, with the hybrid and learning loss that could have happened as a result of the pandemic. This would give more data to teachers to let them know exactly where students are meeting their expectations and where they may need additional support. We held summer school and Boost Acceleration Academies last year. That included the Mayor's Literacy Program, along with academic boost camps at each of our elementary, middle, and high school for additional students to come in to make sure that they were given the boost that they would need to meet grade level learning when they returned in September. We have a Scholars Club and enrichment activities that happen at the elementary level, and they usually only happen in the spring. It's kind of like a boost to get students ready for MCAS testing and end-of-the-year assessments. We started those earlier. They actually, we ran 3 cycles at the schools, at the elementary schools, one in the fall, one in the winter, and there'll still be another one coming this spring. And we have curriculum supports, especially in the area of math, with extra classes at BHS and in-school targeted interventions to help students. We implemented an after-school peer tutoring program for students that needed extra help, and hopefully that was an idea for helping with post-pandemic students that needed to access some help in different subjects. The National Honor Society took that on at both the high school and the middle school. We did not have the turnout in those programs that we had hoped for, and as we know that when you're wearing a mask all day, one of the last things you want to do is stay at school longer with your mask on, and we think that may have been one implication of why the numbers weren't as high. But also, our kids are really busy after school when it comes to either sports, activities for our high school kids, jobs. And so Dr. Morgan and I have looked to research some new companies that are out there that actually provide virtual homework help 24/7, so students can access it from home online, and they can do it when they need it. So if they're coming home and they're doing their homework at 9 or 9:30, hopefully not later than that because they're going to bed to get their 8 hours of sleep, then they will be able to access. We're going to be trained next week on the specifics of how it will work, but they will be able to go online and a tutor will be available to help them. We looked at multiple programs and settled on one this week. I'll be signing the contract tomorrow, and we'll be doing some training for the principals next week to be able to start that rollout. It'll be a pilot for the rest of this year, and then depending on how well it's used, we'll roll over. We have the ability to roll over into next year, and any hours that we don't use this year will be banked and added to next school year. And then for our upcoming summer plans, we are holding summer school. We're also planning boost camps again at our elementaries. We have the literacy program from the mayor, and we're also going to try a new literacy program for students that will be working in the next, up until about May, to select 8 books. There'll be 100 students at each school selected based on low-income status and or struggling students that may not have access to good reading materials at home. They will be able to select 8 books that they will receive mailed home to them individually over the summer. And within each of those books, there will be a insert to help parents on how to talk to the children about that book. And the research showed that when students pick out the literature and it is mailed directly to them, the chances of them reading it go up exponentially. So this is going to be a new program that we're going to try for this summer. Will be one of the, when you ask about ESSER, this is going to be one of the projects that we're going to do through that as a way to close learning gaps, but it's also something that can be short-term once the money runs out if it isn't beneficial. And if it is, then it's something that we can work into our Title I grants in the future, because all 5 of our elementary schools do receive some Title I federal funding.
Okay, thank you. So in terms of special education, I think it's really important to remember that special education specifically is for students who have disabilities. And it's important to remember because as a result of the pandemic, we've had a lot of students who are struggling, but we want to make sure as a district that we're not over-identifying students as being disabled if they're struggling for other reasons, which could be because of the pandemic or other factors at play. And so that being said, we know that there are certainly students who are struggling because of the pandemic, and we also know that some of our most vulnerable students have been disproportionately impacted by the pandemic. And so, you know, as Dr. Flaherty said, there's a lot of different ways of supporting students without necessarily identifying them as having disabilities. So one, as Dr. Flaherty mentioned, is our Bsst process, and this is really a process where special education and general education staff members come together to look at the underlying reasons that students are struggling and to put together a very specific plan of intervention so that we can track progress and make sure that students are receiving the supports that they need regardless of whether or not they're eligible for special education services. We've also had increased evaluations so that we can kind of tease out for some students, you know, what the underlying issues are, what does their learning profile look like, what other factors have been impacting their progress or lack of progress. And so that's something that's been very helpful in terms of identifying student need, but it's also something that is takes a lot of resources to execute, and so that's impacted our department this year. We do have an increase in the mental and behavioral health supports that are available. We've increased the number of BCBAs across our district to help support putting behavior plans in place for students who might be exhibiting challenging behavior. We've increased our school adjustment counselors, we've increased our outreach counselors, and we also have contracted providers who come in to provide additional mental health supports to students who require them. We also have a Beacon program and a REACH program, which are both stabilization programs to support students who are re-entering the school from either a hospitalization or an extended absence, and also to help stabilize students who are just having difficulty managing within the school environment. And then we've also increased our in-district special education programming capacity for students with high needs, and so this has involved increasing the amount of staffing that we have and the intensity of the services that we can provide for some of our most high-need students.
So another opportunity that furthers our school community is cultural proficiency. And so what exactly is cultural proficiency? It's really the knowledge, it's the skills, the attitudes, and the beliefs that enable us all to work together, to respond effectively to one another, and be supportive of people across cultural settings. So you'll notice at the top right of this slide the words inside out. A central tenet of cultural proficiency holds that change, which is what we're asking people to do, is an inside-out process in which a person is first and foremost a student of their own assumptions. This inside-out process allows us as a district leadership team and our wider district leadership team to examine school policies and procedures that really limit cultural proficient practices. The ability to take a look at yourself individually and the organization collectively is really central to the expansive thinking that's needed when we're addressing achievement gaps. And just as important, this process supports our capacity to stand up each day the phrase, all means all. So, here are a few things that we're doing. We are engaged in ongoing training to expand district-wide knowledge about culture, cultural competence, and the many dimensions of culture across our district. We're hosting student forums, focus groups, and assemblies in our middle and high schools in order that student voices are not marginalized, and that all students develop an understanding of the various cultural groups within our community. We're engaging families and community members in our community conversations. We have student programming that focuses on the varied needs of the identities of our students. We're creating structured, intentional spaces for students and staff that are really designed to promote connection, understanding, and dialogue. We're actively engaging communities and families in the development of policy, program design, and service delivery models. We're including culture and cultural competence principles in our strategic planning process. And when we examine data, we're doing so through an equity lens. As we go on to our next slide, as part of our commitment to closing achievement gaps and really preparing our students for life beyond high school, we now have a Director of College and Career Readiness. The College and Career Readiness team is planning to launch a Career Pathways program. In the Career Pathways, you'll see those pathways listed on this slide, are a series of structured and connected education programs and support services. The values in these pathways give students, while they're learning, access to higher levels of education and training in a particular field. Now, why is that important? Because in a real sense, we have the daunting responsibility of preparing students for jobs that don't yet exist in an increasing technological society. Beginning in the 22-23 school year, all freshmen will take a course titled My Future in Career Success. For our teams, it's not enough to simply ensure students pass a set of requirements to exit high school. We want students to leave this district with the skills, the aptitude, and the knowledge that really enables them to achieve their version of the American dream. And that means helping students to think more expansively about post-secondary options and also think about employment, not as a singular job, but as opportunities for careers, advancement, and becoming integral contributors in our society.
Thank you, Dr. Morgan. I'm going to talk to you today about hiring and retaining practices that we have been working on for the past year. When I came on into this position last year, I was able to join the team of Dr. Morgan and at the time Abu Toppin and Pauline Texera from the city side, working together. They had already begun to work together to think of some ways as both the city and the schools that we could look at attracting and retaining a more diverse workforce and kind of thinking about our student populations and having a workforce that's more representative of our student population. So we began that work. One of the things that we did as a group was to reach out to some universities. We are certainly close to Endicott and have a lot of partnerships already with Endicott College, but kind of looking beyond our immediate area to say what other partnerships could we look at. We were fortunate to have a meeting with UMass Boston and kind of start those conversations and looking at how do we develop some of those relationships, whether it's for ourselves, either internship programs or student-teacher opportunities so that we can have other areas that we can tap resources. From there, as a district, we created a team that was representative of teachers, administration, and district-level staff that are part currently of the Department of Elementary and Secondary Education Teacher Diversification Work Group. And we are learning quite a bit in that. We meet monthly as a team to receive training, but then opportunities also to plan together in terms of how we are going to move forward in this direction. So I have shared a few of the strategies that we have, that are in process, that we have begun. And the first is the development and addition of a diversity commitment statement to all of our job descriptions, which just outlines our commitment to diversity, equity, inclusion, and belonging efforts. And it's something that's at the top of our job postings that, when you're looking at attracting and retaining people, this is something that's very important to us. And so that is something that we've worked on as a committee, as well as examining job description language to eliminate bias. And from there, kind of looking at how do you not only attract new staff to our city, but how do we retain them? So we completed a survey. We created one and completed one. Dr. Morgan helped us with that, with the North Shore Affinity Group, which he runs, and really understanding reasons why people remain in their current districts or cities and why they leave. And so it is a group. His affinity group is not just Beverly. It includes other communities, and so it gives us good information as to why people are going to stay and why are they going to leave. So we're in the process right now of looking at that data and how we can implement some of the information that we received from that. We've also worked on kind of researching other districts, and I've had discussions with other districts on various pathway programs that they have currently. So whether it's para to teacher or parent to para programs, ways we can support people within our own community to be part of our community and have other opportunities within our community. And so we've begun a process in that area. I talked about our partnerships and looking at different universities. We've had initial discussions in those areas as well. And finally, we've developed a hiring practices training for our administrators, which we will be implementing this spring.
So I love listening to all of it and hearing from all of the different areas and all the expertise that people bring, but I hope what we've created for you is a picture of our goal, which is to really create multi-tiered systems of support for our students across all domains. We want to make sure that we're addressing academic needs, that we continue to do that we incorporate health needs, that we continue to take a look at that we take a look at social emotional learning and mental health needs, and that we also look at family engagement and how we can make that happen. Our goal is to create an opportunity for us so that every student in the district is known. Whether they're known and we identify that the Tier 1 supports that are in place for them are working for them and moving them in a great direction, that's good information. If they need additional Tier 2 supports, what are they and how do we do that? And if they need even more critical Tier 3 supports, we're able to do that. And I think we identified a number of different areas that we continue to work on. I hope that we gave you an opportunity to see what the work looks like that we do on a daily basis. I think sometimes it's really hard to know what are the things that the school district is digging into and how are they using this $69 million that they're requesting. So I would open it up right now to any questions or through the chairs and presidents or the presidents.
Thank you very much, Dr. Trocheck and your entire team for that presentation. And so we'll do the same thing. We'll go back and forth. So I'll start. Are there any city councilors? Councilor Rand.
Thank you. Move this a little. I guess I just, first of all, thank you for all the presentations and the updates. And it reminded me that I have not checked in with my son to see if he's tuned in to Alex recently. I was like, oh, that's what I was supposed to do. Okay, that's what he was supposed to do. So I have a question. Is the district curriculum education plan unique to Beverly? I've never heard of that before.
Every district has to have one, but each plan may look different depending on the district that it's in. It's not a standardized plan, and it is on our website.
Okay, and that's the additional, am I understanding that correctly? That's sort of what a student can sort of access without an IEP.
Correct. Okay. And any teacher can implement any accommodation on that plan. You don't have to go through a meeting. You don't have to have, it's there for anybody to use for any student.
Okay. And then is Alex actually an example of, early on in the presentation you talked about supporting, a goal of supporting accelerated learning. Is Alex an example of how you're supporting accelerated learning?
It would be one piece of it, yes,
Okay.
because as we talked about it being adaptive, it meets the students where they're at. So if they needed to be, they were here every day last year, they have no concerns, they learned everything they were supposed to learn, they're ready to just fly at their new grade level learning, and or above, maybe they're exceeding expectations. It will make the problems more difficult for them and will push them. But if they had COVID, or the family was out, or there was high absenteeism, or they were struggling because of everything that was going on and they missed a lot of school, and they have some gaps in their skills, then it will help to meet them where they're at and give them practice to learn and to get stronger at where they're at, and then move them forward. So that is one example.
Thanks. And then I just have one more.
Sure.
Okay, thank you. I love the new Pathways program. I don't even know if that's what it's called, but
It
that's
is,
starting
yeah.
with this freshman year. I think that's really exciting. It shows a real, I don't know, it's exciting. I have students in the high school. I'm hopeful that they'll engage with that program. In addition to that, I'm wondering if there's any chance or thought to bringing back a dual enrollment program with local community colleges.
It's happening this year.
So dual enrollment there are opportunities for dual enrollment that it's by a course level, and so I believe that if you have questions about it, I would encourage anyone to have them talk to their guidance counselor. Guidance knows which opportunities are available and how they're available. We've also had so the Director of College and Career Readiness is Julie Ferrara, and she has been bringing forward a number of things. We have an on-campus dual enrollment opportunity right now within a partnership with Endicott for, I think it's a psychology class, embedded into the After Dark program, our dual enrollment programs for our students that are enrolled in that. They have opportunities with North Shore Community College. We have a specific dual enrollment program for our English learners. That is, I think, a set of 9 courses that are specific to supporting some of that. And then there are, I think, a bank of a few other courses. So they're available, and anybody that has any questions about that, students do get this information. That's one of the big improvements that I've seen this year. We have had a course selection problem, program was entirely revamped, and so I think students are getting a lot more support in that course selection process, and guidance will be able to help anyone with something like that.
Thank you so much. I think those are all good sort of responses to the limited availability of, though it's increased with the After Dark program, of accessing the tech school too. So I really think that was a question 2 years ago of mine. So I feel like the district has responded to that, not specifically to my question, but that issue. So thank you.
All set, Counselor Rand?
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Do the committee members have questions? Take another counselor.
All right. Counselor Rotundo.
Thank you. Dr. Trocheck, I know you're a data person. You've always been data-driven. My question is, with the pandemic that we're coming out of right now, one of the concerns I think we all as parents had is the lapse of education that they would be learning. Have you been able to identify kids that may have fallen behind? And I like the fact that you have the shadow program where you see, kids who are high, achievers, and there's the middle ground, and there's those kids who are not so much. Have you been able to really identify in a bigger macro sense that, to me, I looked at the pandemic and said we should keep everyone back because we're really losing a lot of education at the beginning. But have you seen that we're playing catch up at all, or we're really going to have a generation that may be lost in some things?
Yeah, that's a really good question. So first of all, I think one of the opportunities that we had in Beverly was that our elementary students were in person daily. So, and we utilize our data really strongly at the elementary. There's a lot of benchmark assessment and a lot of diagnostic assessments that we do. In terms of academics, I think we have a really clear picture, particularly for that K-5, K-6 level. It's a lot easier to find and identify that data. The work that our curriculum directors at the high school have been doing, or 7 to 12 really, has been to strengthen our use of data in those grades. What we have found is that I think there are learning gaps for students. what our approach has been to continue instructing on grade level standards, but as you reach that unit, using the data to identify, all right, in order, so the progression of skills might be that you should know these 3 things in order to accomplish the next thing. We have pre-tests and we utilize data to tell us who might need more supports in that while we're in that unit, rather than going back and reviewing a whole year. That's what that acceleration model means. I think the area that we're hoping to expand, and that a big push, and somebody asked the question earlier, I think it was Councilor St. Hilaire, about what those increases in next year's appropriated budget. We're looking to find ways to create the same data matrix availability around social emotional learning and around health needs and around family engagement. So that the use of data in that way helps us hopefully proactively to address people that have gaps in their areas, rather than always being reactive. We think that we've utilized the data well. We still have a number of students that still have some gaps. I'm not sure, I don't think any of us think we'll be where we need to be. I think we have another year of work to do around catching up on some of those gap areas. I wouldn't want to.
Yeah, I would agree. And I think that, as Dr. Trocheck said, less concern at the elementary level because they were in every day and they got their academics in the morning. And the data use is so well established there that they're progress monitoring all the time. And we didn't see a major slide at the elementary level, maybe months, but that has been able to be caught up as the year has gone on. The bigger concern, and the one that still holds pause for me, are our students that had high chronic absenteeism last year and may not have re-engaged yet with school and have another year this year of high absenteeism. If they're here, we're going to get to them, we're going to help, but we got to get them into school in order to be able to do that, or continue to look at creative ways to try to re-engage them in the learning process.
I just want to, I spent some time earlier, Mrs. Brown and I were talking at length. I think one of the things that I hope everyone understands and realizes is this pandemic was not just something that happened for 2 years and then we came back to school in September and we were back on. This year has been as tumultuous as the year before, and in some ways more. It almost feels like the first day of school, like at 3 different points in this school year. So we came back in September, and we were masked, and I think we were all really hopeful that we were kind of get right into the groove and things were going to go well. We settled in, and then lo and behold, late fall, came back another, a rise in cases. It was sort of like a pivot. We kind of went back again. I think we all took pause, and then the tide turned, and we kind of had a lowering of cases, and we're coming back, and okay, we're going to take the masks off, and things are going to be back to normal, and the masks came off, and I think unyielded a whole new set of circumstances that we hadn't anticipated were coming, right? And so the students and the teachers and I think everyone in the world, but in terms of education, have had a really tumultuous ride, and so we keep going forward, but then we have to take pause and make sure that we're creating safe environments and that kids are feeling comfortable. And so, it hasn't been like this smooth, easy sailing road where we're just coming back and addressing academics. We've really had to address a number of different challenges along the way. I don't think that any of us are mistakenly thinking that spring is going to be an easy road. If you think about it, for our teachers and for our students and our families, they haven't really had a full year of school. And now think about spring and the stamina levels that it takes to kind of get through. We're going to be bringing on all-night events, nobody's done this in 2 years, and now it's all going to come back, and I think we're all trying to relive 2 years in a 3-month period. So I have caution around how we're moving forward. I think we are doing a tremendous job. Our staff we're so fortunate in Beverly. Our staff is amazing, and they come in every day, and let me tell you, I think, they're experiencing that same roller coaster, right? They think they're gonna, all right, I'm gonna get back in it, and they know that they need to get through these standards, and at the same time, they have kids that need you to respond a little differently. And we kept saying it's been the first 6 weeks of school like over and over and over again, like Groundhog Day almost, right? And so, I think That's why when you look at the supports that Bethany described and that Dr. Flaherty described around, we really need, we tried one way to think that peer tutoring was going to work. Okay, that didn't work as well as we hoped. Let's try another way. Let's try virtual tutoring. Let's see if that's helpful. We're adding BCBAs. We're adding school adjustment counselors. We're doing what we can and assessing as we go along the efficacy of each one that we do. But it is, I think, just a huge moving target. And so we continue to, I mean, I think we're all going to be super hopeful on August 30th, August 29th, next year when we come back, that, okay, maybe we did it. But there's a lot more going on than just this simple return back into school and everything easy peasy. So.
And I would add that some of the biggest gaps we're seeing are not necessarily in academics, but in social skill development. I just had a conversation today with an elementary principal about how we need to teach kids how to play together on the playground because they've missed some of that development, but also we've been telling them for 2 years, they're little, right? We've been telling them, oh, you got to stay away 6 feet, and they don't know how to interact and just have fun together. And then when we look at our high school kids, our sophomores, they haven't had a normal, they were in 7th grade the last time they had a normal set of days and development of skills. And then we wonder why some sophomores in high school are still acting like middle school students. It's because they haven't had that time to grow and to develop the skills.
Okay, from the committee, I saw Ms. Visnick.
Thank you, Madam President. I think I don't have a question, I have a comment, and I think that especially I heard Councilor Sweeney and Councilor St. Hilaire kind of talk about how are we spending the money, and you know, does it do the increases equate to personnel? And I think that what is maybe missed by the maybe some of the jargon is that we know that every single student experienced some amount of trauma. And so, Councilor Rotundo, when you talk about the gaps existed before we went in. And I think that one of the things that not this exact school committee, but one of the things the school committee did a while ago was say, we need to do an audit. And I think we can now look at our budget and any given line item, we can tie the results of that audit right back to a line item in the budget. And we talked about that last week in curriculum, and then again in our committee of the whole, to say, here's the new positions we're adding and here's why. And those items tie right back to the initial slide that Dr. Trocek always starts her presentations with about what are we trying to do as a school system, what are our values, and Chair Abell often says, and I'm a fan of saying as well, our budget is a value statement. And so we should be able to look at what do we want to accomplish and then point to any given line item in our budget and say, this is what we want to accomplish and here's how we're spending our money and here's how that ties back to our values and what we said we wanted to accomplish. And so for everybody up here who wants to know about that, we are, last week was a great meeting, I think, relative to being able to tie those things together. And I certainly invite, you know, I get you every other meeting, right? So, but I invite the other counselors certainly to either tune in, BevCam is great to us, or to, you know, maybe just have another session like this one where we present those ties. And I'm looking at Jean because she's my budget queen. And I think we've done, I have to give our group and our school leadership a lot of credit. And we're about to do something that I think is very brave and it's fairly bold. And I hold out great hope that it'll really show some fantastic results. Thank you.
Councilor Feldman.
Yes, thank you. I am so appreciative of the focus, the budget for that student need driven, and especially a parent of children in the public schools. So I truly appreciate that. And I was wondering if, you know, you touched on it briefly in terms of the students aren't the only ones that have experienced trauma and struggles. I think our teachers and staff have experienced that more than at least one of my kids. And so I was wondering if, there's built into the budget is professional development for the teachers and staff, and I was wondering if there was any consideration or portion of that was considered in terms of supporting the teachers and staff emotional health and mental health, because I know that, and that still is student-driven in my mind, because the mental health and well-being of good teachers and retaining good teachers and staff is really important to any school district, and I just didn't know if there was any consideration to that.
Yeah, so that's ironic that you asked that. I spent the morning on a call with the North Shore Superintendent's group, and we're all kind of sharing and trying to describe different ways of supporting. We're all part of a group called Essex County Learning Communities, and they really are, I would say, a professional development provider for us. They provide opportunities often for teachers to engage in a variety of different workshops that really do talk about, sustaining your own mental health and how do you take care of yourself, and what are some of the things that, so we offer that through that. I think that's a question we're going to continue to grapple with. I don't think there's an easy answer for that right now, but I think that it's one of the greatest priorities that we need to have. We need to be able to make sure that we are watching for and supporting staff as staff needs arise. It was I don't want to say comforting, because it's not comforting at all, but it was interesting to kind of hear that across all of the communities we're all experiencing that same level of concern and hoping to come together to provide some ideas and share ideas. One idea was just floated that literally is not even into creation, but regionalizing some opportunities for teachers to kind of work together across communities. There's lots of ideas that are out there. So,
thank you.
Okay, Dr. Silva.
Could you give us a sense of, from the high school level, what the percentage of absenteeism, chronic absenteeism is?
I can give you specific data. I don't have it with me tonight, but I can get it to you. But they were last year close to 30%.
30%? Wow.
Yeah, chronic absenteeism is defined by DESE as 10% of the school days, so 18 or more school days. So 30% of the students had 18 or more school days in the last school year. Just to define what chronic absenteeism is.
It could have been COVID related.
Yeah.
Okay, so that's 2 weeks right there. A lot of the time.
And that was last year, right?
Correct.
Yeah, that was last year.
That's only 10 days. 2 weeks is only 10 days, right?
Correct.
I understand.
So you got to do almost double that.
We had like but I had two 2-week stints of, that type of thing, so it could, COVID was a hard thing to get numbers around in terms of absenteeism.
We track it and we get the data district-wide and for each school at the beginning of each month, and so we review the data.
I would also just clarify, that was during the hybrid model, right? And
Correct.
And so we had students, if they didn't decide to join us on their hybrid days online, they were absent. So if they were only coming to in-person days, then they were already going to be chronically, that's 40%.
And that did occur. We had students that only came for the in-person days.
So the other question that I had related to that is, are you finding that the absenteeism is related to in-person, and are those students hesitating to come in because of a fear of being exposed, or?
No, the in-person days had better attendance than some of their remote days.
Okay.
But there were instances of both, but the in-person, when they had the connections, actually had better attendance.
Yeah,
and comparatively speaking, and I know elementary is always, they go to a little, they have less of an issue, but I think we had 7% chronic absenteeism at the elementary level. So, we know that was an issue that was specific to the hybrid model and the pandemic.
Right.
However, I don't want to leave anyone with the impression that we still think that chronic absenteeism is an issue and something that we're working really hard to address. We work with a regional group through the Be Healthy Beverly. We have some initiatives that we've put together to try to address it. I believe that we've talked a lot about how this pandemic has been. There have been family dynamics where, school, we have to reteach the elementary kids to play together. We kind of have to reteach some of our secondary students the importance of education and that every day matters, right? Every day matters is our slogan, right? I'm looking at President Abel because she's on the committee that has been taking a look at that closely. So, there's some relearning that has to be done and some redefining of what we do and how we do it.
And it's not a Beverly unique concern. It's the group that we're on the North Shore. It's every community is dealing with some of the same issues.
Yeah. Thank you.
Councillor St. Hilaire.
Thank you, Madam President. COVID has obviously caused a lot of harm across our society, and I think we'll be studying the impacts of all this for decades. I've got 3 kids of my own in the schools, and I appreciate the level of detail in hearing about your responses. I guess my question is sort of related to the previous question about the budget. How much of this response? I mean, this is a lot of stuff. How much of this was budgeted for? Where does the rest of the funding come from? Is this all one-time funding? How much of this is part of that $2 million we're talking about?
Yeah.
How are we paying for all this stuff?
So that's really good, and I spoke earlier to the fact that at school committee we take a look at expenses through the matrix, and at least positionally what positions are charged to ESSER, which positions. So a number of our counseling, a couple of the counseling support positions, some of the reading support positions have been on ESSER as opposed to the appropriated. The large curriculum purchases that we've made, high quality curriculum is a allowable expense on ESSER, so that those were funded through the ESSER funding that we have available. For example, I think the ELA adoption K-12 will probably run somewhere around $600,000 or $700,000, but that expense is that's a one-time expense that will be put onto that ESSER. So it's both, but again, we've been working really hard as a district to maintain a close eye on what, if the pandemic never happened and if we never had ESSER funds, how much money would we need to run the district? That is sort of that bottom line that we hold, and we say, all right, if we didn't have any CARES money, if we didn't have any ESSER money, and if there was no pandemic, where would we need to be? Because we can't lose sight of that, because when all of these things go away, we can't be at a point that we're not funded, that we have to have this enormous increase to catch up again.
Thank you, and just a quick follow-up. Is there a total COVID impact number, budget number, that you would say, this is how much we've spent on responses to COVID?
Well, I don't think I could give you a number there, but I could tell you that the ESSER funding that we received to utilize for that, in that purpose, runs somewhere around $6 million or $6.5 million, and that doesn't account for probably another $800,000 that we used of CARES money from the city. So I'd say that's sort of in the ballpark of. And that money's not all spent, right, so it's budgeted out. We have that through a certain amount, but that resourcing, I don't know that any of us anticipates much more resources coming our way, and so we hopefully think we already know how many we have and how we'll be using it.
And just so we're clear, that's over multiple fiscal years.
Right.
And is the ARPA money that the city got, is that applicable here? Or could it be?
None of the ARPA money has been allocated over to the cities because they have these ESSER pools that they've been able to kind of supplement their budget with.
Thank you.
One more chance for our committee members. Any questions from the committee? Back to the councilors.
Any questions from city councilors?
Councilor Bowen. Thank you. And most of my questions were already asked by others. So mostly just wanted to hear what ideas you might have or requests you might have for connections with other city services or community resources, so whether it's youth services outside of the schools to complement what's happening in the schools and after school, supports to families, as you were saying, that the impact on the entire school community and the entire community has been so intense. So just thinking about where those intersections are, and as we're thinking sort of in our role as the council and complementing the school committee's role, where those areas of intersection are, what you're seeing as additional needs that the schools maybe can't.
So we have a slide.
Yeah.
We have a slide for that.
The messy slide.
This is called our chaos slide.
Yeah.
And actually, it's just really telling you. This is Ms. Visnick earlier said that we've been talking a lot about how we kind of organize and create a systemic approach to some of this. We know that many of the services that we access, many of the community partners that we have, our school adjustment counselors at each building are reaching out and are trying to access and gain access to. We have great partnerships with the Y, with the BCLC, with the Pathways, with a lot of different, with Boots, with everybody, right? And so, but right now, those services are all out there, and we're all kind of grasping for them. One of the things that we hope to do, and I hope the next slide is the right one, is to create this multi-tiered system of supports around wellness, around the whole being of the child. Every one of these supports can be categorized into one of these tiers. It's either a tier 1, tier 2, or a tier 3 community-based support, or a tier 1, tier 2, or tier 3 school-based support. So our goal is to take all of these supports, make sure that we organize them, and create a great, a pool of resources that are accessible, that can be easily matched to student need, and that we are looking at them through this lens of the 3-tiered model, so that we're not all over the place. We need the community. So the schoolhouse at the center of all this. Years ago, the schoolhouse wasn't responsible for all these things. But right now, in the way that our world is kind of running, the schoolhouse is at the center and at the level of where families are reaching out and how they're trying to get engagement. And we know that many of these services are also really taxed right now. So you can't find a bed if you need a bed right now, right? The services out there are taxed to the limit. And so creating a more organized, systemic approach to how we look at student need and how we access community supports and how we even look at our own school-based supports is really crucial to us right now. We actually do this really well for academics. We don't have a chaos slide for academics. We have a really well-defined identification of what our tier 1 supports are, what our tier 2 supports are. We're working really hard, and we've added a ton of extra supports in the district, and so we don't want to just throw bodies, and I said this from the beginning of the pandemic, right? We don't want to just keep throwing counselors in buildings and all of these things without some way to identify how they're utilized, who's accessing them, who needs to access them. And to be honest, the traditional form of providing mental health supports and behavioral supports in schools has been reactive, right? Kid throws a desk, they get some support services. A family has a crisis, we provide them some services. But the goal for us as a school district is to kind of flip that so that we know every child in our district, we know where needs might arise, and we know what services we might be able to apply to them. So that's just in a nutshell where we hope to go. I didn't go here because I didn't want to go on and on for hours and hours. But this is just something that we've been, that was what we were talking about. We spent 2 meetings last week talking about how we might achieve that goal.
Thank you, Councilor Bowen. Any other city councilors? I asked President Abel if I was allowed to ask a question, and she said yes. So if it's okay, Dr. Churchuk and team, I have 2, and they're, I think, different from each other, but hopefully both won't take too long. So the first, it's interesting that you brought up that chaos slide, and Councilor Bowen's question sort of anticipated it, because the first thing I wanted to say, like Councilor Feldman and others up here, I also have a child in the public schools, and just thank you, first of all, for everything that you've been doing. And I also have been thinking a lot recently about how much the pandemic shone a very bright light on lots of systems in our society that didn't work
well, probably never worked well, but somehow we were getting through. But I think it has really shined a bright light on exactly what schools are asked to do, and it certainly is much more than just teaching reading or writing or STEM. So thank you for that. My first question, Dr. Trocheck, I caught the tail end of finance and facilities, so I know you did address this a bit. I'm thinking, just if people weren't watching for that meeting, you mentioned, the excitement about masks coming off and sort of these restarts. Would you or your team be able to talk just a little bit about both how sort of the balance of comfort for students or teachers who aren't yet ready to have their masks off and how that has sort of moved forward or played out in the classroom? And we've, I think, talked about elementary and higher, but I'm also curious about for our early childhood, for our preschool, where children can't yet be vaccinated. Can any of you talk a little bit about just what sort of mitigation and safety processes are happening there?
So I'll start with the day the masks came off, because there was a day when the masks came off, and we all were wondering how that was going to roll out and how that was going to work. Again, masks are optional. You can wear a mask or you don't have to wear it. Right now it's a choice. The first day, I think we were surprised. Probably 60% of our students maintained their masks. Probably 80% of staff maintained their masks. I think that of course, it's sort of like attaining a comfort level of when you were ready to or when you were not. And so I would say now we're down to about 10% of our students wearing masks, and maybe similarly staff. A lot of really interesting things that are being realized, right? So we talked earlier about that 7th grader that was a 5th grader when everything happened. For some students, there was some anxiety about taking the mask off because no one had ever seen. A young man literally said to me, "I can't take this off. No one has ever seen me without a mask on." And so, and think about adolescence and sort of this self, a 13-year-old thinks that the world is an audience and that they're just looking at them and that whatever happens to them is specific to them. And so there was some emotional, I think, pieces of this that we sort of had to grapple with. I would say right now we're in a the students that are still wearing masks are feeling comfortable still wearing masks. Anecdotally, I don't want to report, right? And they're doing so, and I think we're beyond that, but it was definitely a process over, I would say, about a 2-week period of time, and we're kind of at that 3rd week now where has it only been 3 weeks? Oh my goodness, it feels longer. 4 weeks, but it was definitely a process, and but we did not have, I don't think, big. I didn't hear a lot in terms of I do have there are still a few members of the community that are concerned and have questions and wonder, and for them, I can only say that we certainly will support any of your own individual desires to wear a mask, doing everything we can. We had a lot of concerns about whether there would be bullying or not bullying. I don't think around mask wearing it arose to something that we had to spend a lot of energy on, a lot less energy on telling kids to put the masks back on. So that was a time saver for a lot of people. And I'm going to turn it over to Bethany around the preschool question. I've received a couple of questions. Our preschool, our mask optional, but I don't know if you wanted to address any of that.
Yeah, I think, it's important to know with our youngest students, masks were always optional. The mask mandate did not apply to students who were in that age range. We did have most students who did wear masks, and they wore masks really well. They've also transitioned away from wearing masks for the most part without really any issue. All of the other mitigation strategies that were in place, like the spacing and all that, that's obviously not in place anywhere at this point. It's not part of our process anymore. So, kids are getting colds and that type of a thing as expected, but some kids who have their own needs or whose, families are not as comfortable are still wearing masks if they choose.
Thank you. Can I just ask a follow-up to that?
Yeah.
So I hear you completely that mitigation strategies like spacing are not being used anywhere. I think this is something we heard a little bit about in the previous meeting, but especially, again, for those students for whom vaccination isn't something they can access, even if their family would want it when it is available.
Can you talk a little bit about what kind of sanitation of high-touch areas or what kind of other strategies might be happening in our preschool for families to feel confident?
Yeah, I mean, we certainly do all of our, our deep cleaning protocols and, sanitation of high-touch areas. I think the custodial staff is very much on top of those high-touch areas, and they have times throughout the day where they're sanitizing, hand railings and bathrooms and that type of a thing. So we still have all those systems that are in place. It's just really like the social distancing piece that's not so much at play anymore.
And I would say that applies district-wide, not just for the preschool. We also continue with our DisTech cleaning. We actually had that in place prior to the pandemic because we were trying to get rid of the flu. And so we are continuing on with those practices. The pandemic, through the last 2 years, we've also really worked to improve. Well, I think strengthen, I don't know improve, I think we always had a pretty good one, but our HVAC practices around filters and changing, and we've been running our HVACs at full capacity, which isn't very good for the environment, but apparently very good for airflow. We have the cleaning, I think we've just become more vigilant in our cleaning. We have procedures around cleaning, and we're watching really carefully. And then finally, I think we do supplement when needed. If we have areas that need deep cleaning, we'll use outside services if we have to. But we haven't changed any of our cleaning protocols from pre-pandemic, from the beginning of the pandemic to now.
Thank you. President Abel, may I ask one last question? Thank you. So this is the one I said was a really different topic, but I appreciated the presentation, well, all the presentations, but one on this side of the table that I watched over here, I really appreciated just seeing the breadth and the depth of what the district is both offering and striving to offer in terms of education, working to educate children as whole people, and also think about, Dr. Moran, you talked about that inside-out change. And project-based learning and social-emotional learning. And so I guess my question is, and I know this might be somewhat of a loaded question, just given the part of the way that schools are assessed by the state, but my question is, in all of that, obviously our schools also have to take MCAS tests. And so my question is just how do you balance, it seems like there's so many other things in this breadth and depth of what you are trying to accomplish. And I'm not coming at this question saying that they're contrary to each other, but I guess my question is, sometimes standardized testing, a critique of it is that it is inherently inequitable. And so I hear you all talking as a team about ways to increase equity and work on social emotional learning and support and project-based learning for students. So I wonder if you could just talk to us just briefly about ways, how does the MCAS fit into that, and how do you sort of balance the need for teachers and students to be prepared for a standardized test while you're trying to balance all of these other growth kind of pieces?
Well, I think I'll just start off with, I'm going to go back to repeating that this year hasn't been completely smooth and fluid. I think that we came back with the intention that we were going to get right on track with all of our accelerated learning and our standards. We tried very hard throughout the year to just keep going back to our goals and making sure that we're doing it. I think I also wanted to say that project-based learning doesn't preclude standards-based assessment. So a good project is designed based on standards and based on mastery of standards and has a rubric that would identify how students are learning and doing in those standard areas. So with a well-done project-based learning unit, it should not impact MCAS scores at all. The goal should be that the instruction is the same, it's just delivered in a more relevant and authentic way, and tapping into higher interest and a higher level of engagement. So I guess, in fact, it should make better MCAS scores. I think that that's why we were attempting in pre-pandemic to utilize project-based learning as a real, foundation for the work that we do and for the curriculum reviews that we were doing. And when we look to purchasing new curriculum materials, we're looking through an equity lens, which means, are they culturally relevant? Are they are they representative of all of the students in our district? But are they also providing those authentic learning experiences? I just go back to the Plaid phonics workbooks from the early years and say we just really don't want to have Plaid phonics workbooks anymore. So I think our goal is to do all that. I don't know how we just gave MCAS for 2 days at the high school the last 2 days. We're entering into an MCAS season. I think I've never been a person who's been opposed to MCAS. I think there's a purpose for it. I think the question is how relevant it is in each year that you take it, and you really have to take a look at all of the other things that are going on as you look at them. But I do appreciate a good benchmark. So, for me, there's some value to it, and then there's some, but it can't, in this particular year, I'm not sure I don't know how it will look for us, and I don't know how it will turn out. So.
Thank you. And I realized my question might have sounded like I was concerned mostly about MCAS achievement, but I was sort of asking, I think, it sounds like we have this really holistic approach, and do standardized tests sometimes hinder our ability to do this holistic approach, which you did just answer. I just wanted to clarify that that wasn't my attempt to
If there was a
check up on your
hyper-focus on it, I
MCAS.
would say yes. I don't think we're
Okay.
hyper-focused on a test. I think we're more hyper-focused on standards, mastery of standards, and looking at it that way. So.
Ms. Bisnick.
I want to say to you that didn't we work side by side the other day and trick children into learning 5th grade science?
I'm not really sure where this is going.
Well, I just said that we...
I don't want to be accused of tricking children.
No, so we tricked them into having fun, right? They had fun, and in having the fun, they learned something, and what they were learning and what they were reinforcing, right here in this school, we had Salem, help me with the name. Coastal Sound Watch, do a fantastic program. There were a whole bunch of people, some other people around this table, I think, who volunteered. And there were 5 stations, and the children went through the stations, and very hands-on, and in fact, I would not have necessarily known this, except that the people from Salem Sound Coastal, whatever, I'm so bad with names, talked about, at this station, this is the MCAS, topic that we're reinforcing. And you wouldn't necessarily know that. It was like fun. We're going to go to this station. We're going to do this activity. And so, in our house, we joke about it, like, they tricked me into learning by making me have fun. I'm like, and that's terrible. Why? Right? So I think that that's a equivalency. When we can do things like that and bring programs in like that, and I believe that part of the city budget paid for that. So that was a wonderful thing, right, for Mr. Collins and the engineering team to say, here's some budget to help us teach our children how to take care of our water streams, and while doing that, learn something that's going to be on it's important to know in general. Turn the water off when you're brushing your teeth. But then also is going to be somewhere tested as well. So,
That's a great point.
We had fun doing that too.
We did have fun doing that too.
And I think that this has been a wonderful opportunity. I know the city charter only requires us to do this once per calendar year, but certainly something that I would be open to continuing the conversation. I think there's just so much overlap between our 2 committees. Yes. With that, I believe we've reached 10 o'clock, and we do have energy efficient lighting. I'm not sure if we're going to be...
We've got to blink already.
In the dark in a moment.
10 o'clock.
I would ask...
It got brighter, and I was like...
last call. I would like to ask my committee if I could have a motion to adjourn.
So moved.
Thank you, Ms. Bisnick. Is there a second?
Second.
Oh, I have Dr. Silva here. It's not debatable. All those in favor on the committee? We have 6.
On City Council, is there a motion to adjourn?
So moved.
Second. Thank you. And all those in favor?
Aye.
Thank you very much. Well, we're adjourned.
Thank you, everyone, for joining us, and thank you, BevCam.
It's electronic, no paper. I can convert this to text.